At 63, I lost everything. Not slowly, not dramatically, just all at once. The house was gone. The car was repossessed. The accounts were frozen. One bad signature. One deal I should have walked away from. 3 months later, I was standing in my son's driveway with 2 suitcases and no place left to go. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 63 years old. I'm a widower, and until recently, I had never asked my son for anything in my life. That night, as I slept in the guest room of the house he owned, I realized something colder than bankruptcy itself. Losing your money is painful, but losing your place in your own family is something else entirely. If you've ever had to depend on someone you once supported, I want you to listen to this story. And before we go any further, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. After the first night sleeping in the small room at my son's house, I barely slept at all. It wasn't because the bed felt unfamiliar. It was because, for the first time in my life, I realized I had traveled a very long road only to return to the exact position I had always feared standing in. Dependence on someone else. But to understand how a 63-year-old man like me ended up in that situation, you need to know how I lived before everything collapsed. My name is Daniel Mercer, 63 years old, widowed. 6 years ago, my wife, Helen, passed away after nearly a year battling pancreatic cancer. We didn't have a beautiful ending like in the movies. No long final words, no sunsets holding hands on the porch. Just quiet afternoons in the hospital, the steady hum of machines, and the eyes of a woman who was ready to leave but still worried about the one staying behind. After the funeral, I returned to the house we had bought more than 30 years earlier and for the first time lived alone in a space that had been built for 2 people. The house wasn't large, a single-story home in the suburbs of Illinois with just enough front yard to mow every weekend and just enough porch to sit and drink coffee in the morning. I had paid off the mortgage long ago. No debts, no loans. After Helen died, I kept everything in the house exactly the same for nearly a year. Not because I couldn't handle change, but because I didn't want to make any decisions while my emotions were still unstable. I slowed my life down, woke up earlier, went to bed earlier, and kept my life as simple as possible. I spent my entire career working in commercial property management. It wasn't a glamorous job. No glass tower offices or gold-embossed business cards. My work was about keeping things running smoothly, lease agreements, maintenance, cash flow, and above all, risk avoidance. I was used to reading the fine print at the bottom of the page, used to asking uncomfortable questions, used to saying no when the numbers didn't make sense. Maybe that's why, for many years, I was never involved in a major lawsuit and never lost sleep over money. I wasn't a flashy spender. Helen and I never chased things beyond our means. We drove ordinary cars. We didn't replace them just because a new model came out. We didn't take luxury vacations. I kept meticulous records. Every document had its place. Every contract I signed was read at least twice. Not because I distrusted everyone, but because I believed the final responsibility always belonged to the person holding the pen. After Helen died, many people assumed I would sell the house, move somewhere else, or withdraw from life. But I didn't. I continued living at my own pace, worked a few more years, prepared for retirement in a deliberate way. I had a pension. I had modest savings. Not enough to be considered wealthy, but enough that I didn't have to worry about the basics. More importantly, I felt that I was still standing on my own 2 feet. My only mistake came from something I had trusted for far too long: people. It was a former partner, someone I had worked with more than 10 years earlier. We weren't close in a family-friend sense, but we had collaborated on a few stable projects. He came to me while trying to salvage a struggling commercial real estate deal. The market had begun to show signs of instability, but no one was calling it a crisis yet. He needed someone to provide a temporary guarantee to keep the project afloat during a restructuring phase, not to borrow more money for him, but to prevent existing clauses from being triggered. I hesitated. For a long time, I reviewed the files, I read the reports, I asked questions he didn't like answering, but everything on paper still seemed reasonable. I wasn't lured by promises of quick wealth. There were no guarantees of high returns, just a proposal framed as professional responsibility. If I stepped in as a short-term guarantor, the project had a chance to restructure and everyone could get out intact. I signed, not out of greed, but because I believed I understood the risk and believed I was helping a situation survive its worst phase. I had done similar things before, and they had never come back to bite me. But this time was different. The market reversed faster than expected. Cash flow dried up. The bank tightened its terms, and that partner pulled back. Not completely disappeared, but withdrew at the exact moment everything began to collapse. Legally, my signature was enough. No explanations required, no sympathy needed, no one asked what my motives had been. On paper, I was responsible, and I didn't try to run from that. 3 months. Just 3 months for everything to unravel. The first letters arrived politely, then came the phone calls, then the official notices. I sold what I could sell. I cut everything non-essential, but some numbers cannot be negotiated. Some debts cannot be fixed with goodwill. The day they posted the foreclosure notice on my door, I stood there for a long time, not angry, not panicked, just a very clear sense of emptiness, as if a part of my life had been crossed out in red ink. The car was towed away early one morning. I heard the engine outside, looked through the window, and knew exactly what was happening. I didn't go out to argue. I didn't make any calls. I just stood there, one hand on the window frame, and let out a long breath. The most painful part wasn't losing the house or the car. It was realizing that every plan I had trusted was built on the assumption that I would never make a major mistake. And I was wrong, not because I was foolish, not because I was reckless, but because I believed that doing the right thing would always be protected. In reality, it isn't. When I called my son, Michael, I didn't beg. I just told the truth. I said I was bankrupt, that I no longer had a house, that I needed a place to stay for a while. On the other end of the line, he was silent for a long time. I could hear his breathing, and I knew he was weighing not just emotion, but consequences. In the end, he said I could come stay, temporarily, until things stabilized. I thanked him, said nothing more, and in that moment, I didn't yet understand that the word temporarily would become the foundation for everything that followed. I packed my belongings into 2 suitcases. Only the essentials, files, documents, a few sets of clothes. I locked the house for the last time, placed the key in an envelope, and dropped it into the mailbox like someone returning something that no longer belonged to him. I didn't look back, not because I didn't care, but because I knew that if I did, I wouldn't be calm enough to keep moving forward. And that was how I, Daniel Mercer, at 63 years old, went from a man who had always stood on his own into the most fragile chapter of my life, not because I lost money, but because I was about to live in a house where I was no longer the one who made the rules. Nothing disappeared in a single day. It left piece by piece, like air slowly being drawn out of a room you're standing in. You don't realize you're suffocating until it's already too late. The first letter arrived on a Monday morning. A white envelope, no flashy logo, just the bank's address printed small in the corner. I'd handled that kind of letter for decades in my line of work, so I didn't open it right away. I made coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, read the newspaper as usual. Only when the coffee had gone halfway cold did I tear open the envelope. The wording was very polite. No threats, no harshness, just a notice that the guarantee I had signed was being activated and that the bank needed to clarify legal responsibility. Then came the second letter, then the third. Each one shared the same thing. None of them cared about my circumstances. They only cared about the signature. I called. I sent emails. I explained. Not to evade responsibility, but to buy time. Time to sell assets. Time to reorganize whatever could still be organized. But time was not something I had much of then. The foreclosure notice arrived on a rainy afternoon. I remember it clearly because I had just finished mowing the lawn, the smell of wet grass still clinging to my sleeves. The man delivering the papers didn't look at me for long. He did his job, nodded politely, and left. I stood on the porch holding the paper, staring at the words, "Notice of foreclosure," as if they were a sentence written in a language I had read my entire life, but never imagined I would have to read for myself. I didn't shout. I didn't call anyone. I simply went inside, placed the paper on the table, and sat down. For a very brief moment, I thought of Helen. Wondered if things might have been different if she were still alive, but the thought passed quickly. I had never believed in hypotheticals. I believed in reality, no matter how hard it was to accept. In the days that followed, I began selling what could be sold, not because I thought it would save the house, but because I didn't want the bank to take everything as if I had never existed there. I sold furniture. I gave away what couldn't be sold. I boxed up files, sorted documents, as if keeping things orderly might help me preserve a small sense of control in a life that was cracking apart. The car was towed away very early one morning. It wasn't fully light yet. I was standing in the kitchen washing my coffee mug when I heard the sound of metal clanging together outside. I didn't need to look to know what it was. That sound has its own distinct rhythm. I dried my hands, walked to the window, and saw my car being hooked up. The tow truck driver didn't look at me. He focused on the cables, the gauges, his work. I stood there, one hand on the window frame, and thought about all the times I had driven that car home after a long day at work, believing that at least I always had a place to return to. When the car drove away, the street in front of the house looked noticeably emptier, not because a car was missing, but because a sign that I was still living a normal life was gone. I went back inside, finished washing the mug I had left half done, and set it upside down like every other day. Habits are the last things to abandon you. I took the wedding photo down from the wall on the third day after receiving the foreclosure notice. It had hung there for years, in the middle of the living room, not prominent, but always in the right place. I hadn't had the courage to take it down sooner. As I lifted the frame off the wall, I wiped the dust from the glass with my sleeve. Helen was smiling in the photo, that familiar smile making me pause a few seconds longer than necessary. I didn't cry. I simply placed the picture into a box, wrapped it in one of my old sweaters, as if doing so might keep it a little safer. There were evenings when I sat in the nearly empty house, listening to the wind outside, and wondered how everything could fall apart so quickly. But the answer was always the same. The system has no place for emotion. It only has room for clauses. I didn't tell my son right away, not because of shame, but because I wanted to be sure I had exhausted every option before picking up the phone. I didn't want to call him just to complain. I didn't want to put him in a position where he had to choose between duty and his own life too soon. I still believed I could manage on my own, even as that belief grew thinner with each new letter. But then one morning, I stood in the middle of the empty living room, looked around, and realized there was nothing left to manage. Every option had been tried, every number had been added and subtracted, and the result was still the same. That was when I knew I was about to lose not only the house, but also the right to pretend that everything was still fine. On the last day I left the house, I woke up very early. I walked through each room, not to say goodbye, but to make sure I hadn't forgotten anything important. Documents, medical records, a few old books. I locked the door, stood on the porch, and took the key out of my pocket. I thought I would keep it, as a keepsake. But then I realized that the key no longer opened this door, at least not legally. I put it into an envelope, wrote the bank's address on it, and dropped it into the mailbox. In that moment, I felt a little lighter, not because the loss was over, but because I no longer had to cling to something that no longer belonged to me. The call to my son happened immediately after. I stood by the side of the road, phone pressed to my ear, looking at the other houses in the neighborhood, houses that still had people living in them, still had cars parked out front. I spoke briefly. I told the truth. No embellishment, no blame. On the other end of the line, Michael was silent for a long time. I could hear his breathing, and in that silence, I knew something had changed forever. From that moment on, our relationship would never be the same again. When he agreed to let me come stay, I thanked him. That was all. I didn't promise things would get better soon. I didn't commit to anything except not being a burden beyond what was necessary. I ended the call, looked back at the road one more time, and pulled the single remaining suitcase toward me. Losing everything is not a loud moment. There is no thunder, no dramatic collapse. It arrives quietly, step by step, until you find yourself standing in the emptiness and realize that everything that once defined you, home, work, independence, has disappeared. And the only thing left is you, with the one question no one else can answer for you. What will you do next when there is nowhere left to retreat? I didn't call my son immediately after leaving the house. I pulled my suitcase along for a while, then stopped at a small parking lot near the old shopping center where I used to stop by every weekend. I sat in the rental car, my hands resting on the steering wheel, and let the phone lie still on the seat beside me. There are some calls that, if you make them too early, you end up saying things you don't need to say. I didn't want this call to turn into a complaint. I also didn't want it to become an apology for things I hadn't intentionally caused. When I dialed Michael's number, I already had in mind exactly what I would say. Not long, not roundabout, no recounting, just the truth. Enough for him to understand the situation and enough for him to make his own decision. The phone rang 3 times before he answered. His voice sounded tired, maybe from work, maybe from surprise. I didn't offer much of a greeting. I didn't ask how he was. I went straight to the point. "I'm bankrupt," I said. "I've lost the house." On the other end of the line, there was no immediate reaction, no sharp intake of breath, no hurried questions, just a silence that stretched longer than usual. I could hear faint background noise, maybe traffic, maybe an office, but Michael didn't say anything. I didn't fill the silence. I had said enough. After a few seconds, he asked very slowly, "Dad, are you okay?" That was the only personal question in the entire call. I answered honestly. "I'm okay," I said. "I just don't have anywhere to live." I didn't add that the car had been repossessed. I didn't say I was sitting in a rental car with 2 suitcases. I didn't mention that I had put the house key into an envelope and dropped it into the mailbox. I didn't think those details would help him decide anything. I also didn't want him to feel cornered by vivid images. Michael was silent again, this time longer. I could picture him calculating in his head, not because he was cold, but because he was an adult now, with his own family, his own responsibilities. I understood that. I had once been in his position. I didn't resent the silence. I simply noted it. "Do you have any plans?" he asked. "Not for now," I said. "I've tried every other option." That was the truth. I didn't explain what every option included. I didn't mention shelters. I didn't mention cheap room rentals. I wanted him to understand that this call wasn't my first choice, but my last. Michael took a long breath. I heard it clearly. "You could come stay with us for a while," he said. Then he paused, as if weighing every word. "I mean, just temporarily." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "I understand." "I mean," he continued, "only until things stabilize, until you can get things sorted out." "Yeah," I said, "temporarily." He repeated the word once more, as if to make sure we were talking about the same thing. "Temporary," he said in English, his tone a bit stiff. "You understand, right?" "Of course," I replied. "I don't intend to stay long." For a very brief moment, I considered saying something more to reassure him, that I wouldn't be a burden, that I could take care of most things myself, that I didn't need much space. But I stopped. I realized that the more I promised, the weaker a position I would be placing myself in. I didn't want to begin this stage of my life by negotiating my place in my son's house. Michael said he would talk to Emily, that they would need to rearrange the guest room, that there would be some rules so things wouldn't get messy. He spoke quickly during that part, as if afraid I might misunderstand. I listened without objecting, without asking questions. I had already agreed to the most important thing. I would come. Everything else could be dealt with later. When the call ended, I stared at the phone for a long time, not because I was waiting for him to call back, but because I was letting the feeling settle. I didn't feel rescued. I didn't feel diminished either. I simply felt that I had just crossed an invisible line, from someone who always made his own decisions to someone who had to ask permission to exist in another person's space. I drove to Michael's house in the late afternoon. His house was in a newer neighborhood, larger, everything still looking fairly new. I parked on the street, not because there was no space in the garage, but because I hadn't been invited into it. I pulled my suitcase up onto the porch and waited a few seconds before ringing the doorbell. Not out of nervousness, but because I wanted to be sure I was ready to step into this new role, the role of a guest. Michael opened the door. He smiled, but it wasn't the same smile as before. It carried a bit of tension, a bit of responsibility. Emily stood behind him, nodded politely in greeting. No one hugged anyone. No one said much. Everything unfolded very orderly, very neatly, like an agreement that had already been prepared. "You'll stay in this room," Michael said, pointing toward the end of the hallway. "Just temporarily." "Until things stabilize," Emily added, her voice gentle but clear. I set my suitcase down, looked around the small room, and nodded. I didn't feel ashamed. I also didn't feel overly grateful. I simply noted every detail, every word that was repeated, because in my life, words that are repeated often aren't meant to emphasize kindness. They're meant to define boundaries. And when I closed the door behind me, I understood that temporary wasn't just a period of time, it was a position. And from that moment on, everything I did in this house would be measured by those two words. On my first night at Michael's house, I didn't fully unpack. I opened my suitcase, took out my sleepwear and toothbrush, then zipped it back up. My old habit was to organize everything as soon as I arrived somewhere new, but this time I didn't. Maybe because I knew I hadn't really arrived. I was just staying somewhere while waiting. Temporarily. The room assigned to me was at the end of the hallway, next to the laundry room. It was clean enough, bright enough, and small enough that no one had to sacrifice much for it. A single bed, a small dresser, a foldable desk. No pictures, no decorations. I tried turning the door lock, then realized there wasn't one. Not broken, just never installed. I stood there for a few seconds, my hand on the doorknob, then let go. No one said I wasn't allowed to lock the door, but no one said I had the right to either. On the first morning, I woke up early out of habit. My body clock didn't care where I was. I stepped into the hallway quietly, trying not to make any noise. Michael's house was quiet in the way young families' homes are. Everything arranged logically, no wasted corners. I stood in the kitchen, looked around, and waited. Not because I didn't know how to make coffee, but because I didn't know what I was allowed to use. Emily appeared a few minutes later. She greeted me, smiled politely, and then began talking about how things work in this house. She spoke gently, clearly, like she was explaining things to someone starting a new job. Breakfast times, laundry days, which shelves in the refrigerator belong to whom, which appliances should be used sparingly because the electricity bill has been a bit high lately. Not a single sentence was offensive, but taken together, I realized I was being granted permission to use the space, not permission to live in it. Michael stood there listening, nodding, occasionally adding a sentence to soften the atmosphere. He called me Dad at first, but whenever Emily mentioned anything related to rules, he went silent. No objections, no confirmation, just standing in between, like a bridge that didn't want to be pulled to either side. The days that followed passed very evenly. I ate breakfast with them, but always after they had started. I cleaned up after using anything, even though no one asked me to. I didn't turn on the TV when I was home alone. I didn't stay out late, not because I was afraid, but because I didn't want to become a topic that needed to be discussed at the end of the day. Emily was very consistent. Her tone never changed. She didn't show irritation. She didn't raise her voice, but everything had clear limits. I could use the washing machine on Tuesdays and Fridays. I could use the car if I really needed to, and should give notice. I shouldn't have guests because the house isn't used to strangers. All of it made sense, if I were a guest. But I didn't know what I was in this house. I realized it most clearly one afternoon when I accidentally left my bedroom door open. Emily walked past, stopped, and closed it for me. To keep things tidy, she said. I thanked her. But when the door closed, I understood that the only space I had here was space that was permitted, and even that space didn't fully belong to me. Michael started calling me Daniel in conversations when Emily was present. At first I thought it was just habit, but then I noticed when speaking privately to me, he still said Dad. When Emily was there, or when talking about me to others, he used my name. Daniel, very neutral, very grown up, and very distant. Once when one of Michael's friends called, I heard him say, "Yeah, Daniel's staying with us for a bit." Not my dad, not my father, just Daniel, an older man staying temporarily. I didn't correct him, not because I didn't notice the change, but because I understood this wasn't about words. It was about position, and that position was quietly slipping out of my hands. In the evenings, I usually went back to my room early. There was nothing to do except read or look at my phone. I could hear them talking in the living room, soft laughter, the TV, the sounds of a normal family. I wasn't jealous. I just felt like I was standing outside a circle I had once been at the center of. One time, I accidentally left my bedroom light on when I went out. When I came back, Emily reminded me, very gently, very politely. But that evening, I noticed a small note taped next to the light switch in my room. Please turn off lights when not in use. I looked at it for a long time, not angry, not sad, just noting another boundary that had just been drawn. I began to feel that my time here wasn't measured in days, but in tolerance. Every action of mine was being weighed, not by me, but by the space I was occupying. I no longer made decisions. I only reacted, and every reaction had to be small enough not to draw attention. The most frightening thing wasn't being controlled. It was realizing that you start controlling yourself before anyone else has to. I caught myself checking the time before stepping out of my room, softening my footsteps on the floor, even lowering my voice on phone calls, though the person on the other end had nothing to do with this house. One evening, when Michael handed me a piece of paper, a simple residency agreement, he spoke very quickly, saying it was just a formality to make things clear. I took the paper, read it, and nodded. I signed, not because I agreed with everything in it, but because I was used to signing in order to keep the peace. When I put the pen down, I realized something. I was no longer the one who made the rules, nor the one who broke them. I was the one who lived inside them, temporarily. And in that house, every time someone mentioned the word temporary, I heard it as an unspoken reminder, you are here by someone else's patience. Don't forget that. I didn't know then that these boundaries were only the beginning, that losing the right to decide would lead to losing the right to refuse. But I felt very clearly that I was being made smaller, not through hostility, but through order. And that, to me, was the most dangerous form of confinement. Control didn't arrive with a blow. It came with white paper, black ink, and a calm voice. Once you get used to asking permission to use the kitchen, signing a piece of paper no longer feels like a big deal. At least, that's what I thought. The first document appeared on a Thursday afternoon. Emily placed it on the kitchen table, right next to the coffee machine where I was standing pouring water. She didn't hand it to me directly. She simply set it down like an item that needed to be processed. Just for legal precaution, she said, her voice as gentle as always. You know, in case something happens, this house needs to be clear. I picked up the paper, a short residency agreement, not complicated, no difficult terminology, just a confirmation that I was staying temporarily, had no ownership rights, and could be asked to leave at any time. I read slowly, carefully. Old habits resurfaced, but this time habit didn't lead to resistance. Just temporary, Michael said, standing behind Emily. He didn't look at me when he said it, until things stabilize. I nodded. Temporary. I signed, not because I agreed with every line, but because I was already too deep in this role to turn back. I didn't want to turn a quiet afternoon into a legal debate in my son's kitchen. I told myself that this signature didn't take away anything I hadn't already lost. And that's how people convince themselves to take one more step downhill. After that paper, things moved faster. Not loudly, not abruptly, just a series of for convenience. Emily suggested that I move my pension direct deposit into the family's joint account, just so it's easier for us to manage, she said. You won't have to worry about the small things anymore. I asked very gently, can I keep my own account? Emily smiled. You can, she said, but that would be a bit complicated. Besides, you're staying here temporarily. Michael stood there, silent again. This time, his silence was no longer neutral. It was wordless approval. I looked at my son, waiting for something, a balancing sentence, a minimal defense, but he just nodded, as if everything had already been agreed upon. I transferred it. Not that same day. I said I needed time. A week later, I did it. I told myself it was just money passing through a different door, not me handing over decision-making power. But when the first pension payment no longer appeared in my old account, I felt a very clear absence, not of money, but of agency. From then on, every expense had a process. I needed cash to buy medication. Emily transferred it. I wanted to buy a book. Michael asked the price. I needed to replace an old pair of shoes. They said to wait until the end of the month. No one outright refused. No one said no. But every time I had to ask, every time I had to explain, I felt myself shrink a little. I began calculating in my head before speaking. Is it necessary? Is it urgent? Can it wait? I cut back on things that never used to require permission. Coffee from a cafe, printed newspapers, longer walks so I wouldn't need the car. I limited myself to avoid having to ask. And that was when I realized control had completed its circle, from the outside to the inside. One morning, I noticed a note taped to the refrigerator, household expenses. Below it were listed lines, electricity, water, internet, groceries. There was a small line added in a different pen, additional costs, Daniel. I stood there for a long time. No one said anything. No one explained. The note was simply there, like a fact to be accepted. I wasn't angry. I wasn't sad. I just felt myself being moved from the position of family to the position of an item, something to be tracked, a cost to be controlled. Some evenings, when I asked for money to buy a few small things, Michael asked if I could bundle them together so they wouldn't have to make multiple transfers. He said it very reasonably. I agreed. I always agreed. Agreement became the safest reflex. I started keeping track of my own spending, even though no one asked me to. A small notebook where I wrote the date, the amount, the purpose. Not to prove anything, but to remind myself that I was still capable of responsibility, even though decision-making power was no longer mine. But every time I opened the notebook, I saw the irony of the situation. I was auditing my own life, while having no authority to approve it. Emily always mentioned legality. Just as a precaution, she said, "You understand." She talked about risk, insurance. What if something happened in the house? Everything made sense. Too much sense. And that very reasonableness made it hard to push back. I wasn't someone who argued emotionally. I had spent my whole life respecting clauses. Now, clauses were coming back to define me. Once, I needed cash urgently because my medication wasn't covered by insurance in time. I texted Michael. It took nearly 2 hours before he replied. "Tonight, Dad." I sat on the chair in my room, looking at the clock, and thought about how 10 years earlier I would have driven myself to the pharmacy, paid, and been home before dark. Now I waited, not because I didn't have money, but because my money was in an account I couldn't touch. When Michael transferred the money, he added a message. "Next time, let us know earlier so we can arrange it." I replied, "Okay." Just one word. I didn't want to open any exchange that might turn into a lesson on management. I began to feel like I was living inside a very neat structure where everything had a reason, but there was no room for freedom. I wasn't being insulted. I wasn't being shouted at. I was being arranged, and that arrangement was wrapped in the language of care. The most unsettling part was realizing I was no longer seen as a person with a history, but as a variable to be managed. I was no longer the man who raised Michael, the one who had handled his early troubles. I was Daniel, a temporary resident with a fixed income and needs to be managed. One evening, as I signed off on an expense Emily had fronted, I paused my pen for a second. The familiar feeling of ink on paper reminded me of the hundreds of contracts I had signed. Contracts where I was the decision maker, the responsible party, the one who could say no. I kept signing, but in that moment, I understood that I had just been turned into a legal burden, not because I caused trouble, but because this system needed me in that position to function smoothly. I didn't say it out loud. I didn't resist. I just remembered, because I knew that when power is formalized through paperwork and accounts, the next question is no longer, "What does Dad need?" but "Are you willing to sign?" And when a man no longer has the right to hold his own money, that question is only a matter of time. After a while, I stopped trying to understand what position I occupied in that house. Not because I had grown used to it, but because I realized that trying to define it only made me more tired. I focused on small, concrete things I could control, schedules, medication, small chores I could do, so I wouldn't become a static figure in the room at the end of the hallway. But it was precisely in those small things that the signs began to appear. The first letter wasn't addressed to me. It was sent to Michael, a white envelope, a faint bank logo printed in the corner. I saw it because Emily placed the mail on the kitchen table while sorting through bills. She didn't hide it. She didn't avoid it. The letter sat there for a few minutes, long enough for me to see the bold words "important notice." I didn't read it. I didn't pick it up. I simply noted it. A few days later, I noticed an email that had been printed out and clipped to a stack of papers near the printer. The subject line read, "Account review required." I was familiar with that kind of title. It wasn't a red alert, but it wasn't routine mail either. It was the kind of message that appeared when a cash flow no longer met the original assumptions. I walked past it, glanced at it, and kept going. No one said anything, and I didn't ask. The first call came one afternoon when I was home alone. The landline rang. I didn't usually use it, but that day I picked it up out of old habit. A polite female voice, very well trained, asked for Michael Mercer. I said he wasn't home. She thanked me and hung up. She didn't give a reason, but I knew that kind of call. It wasn't a sales call. It was an early-stage collection call, gentle enough not to be considered intrusive, but frequent enough to apply pressure. I set the receiver down very slowly, not because I was confused, but because I was fitting pieces together in my head. I didn't investigate. I didn't open the mail. I didn't access the email. I just let them be there, like signals that someone with years in the field couldn't fail to recognize. After that came more letters. Not every day, but regularly enough to form a rhythm. Not every bank wrote the same way, but their language did. Polite openings, sections about reviews, adjustments, temporary measures. Words I had used countless times in my career when a property began drifting out of its safe range. I started noticing how Emily organized the paperwork. Important envelopes were no longer mixed in with regular bills. They were kept separately, closer to her workspace. I didn't intrude, but I recognized that the separation wasn't accidental. It was the reflex of someone trying to control the flow of information. Michael began coming home later. Not all the time, but often enough for me to notice. When he did come home, he was usually tired, quieter, and more easily irritated. Not with me, but with small things. The remote not in the right place. The living room, light still on, water running too long in the bathroom. Those reactions were familiar to me. I had seen them before in people standing under financial pressure they didn't want to name. I didn't ask. I didn't offer advice. Not because I didn't care, but because I knew that if I asked, I would be pushed back into the position already assigned to me, a guest with no right to intervene. Instead, I observed, and I compared. I compared the rhythm of the mail. I compared the timing of the calls. I compared the way Michael talked about work with the way he was actually living. Each of those things taken alone meant nothing, but placed side by side, they formed a very familiar pattern, a pattern I had seen many times in commercial properties, when fixed costs exceeded real cash flow and management began using the word temporary to cover up a long-term imbalance. The word temporary appeared everywhere, in emails, in letters, in Emily's speech, just until things stabilize. I heard that phrase and felt a chill run down my spine, not because I was afraid, but because I knew that phrase was usually used when the speaker was no longer sure things would stabilize. One evening, when Michael thought I was already asleep, I heard the two of them talking in the kitchen, not loudly, not in whispers, just low, tired voices. I didn't catch every word. I didn't try to, but there were phrases you didn't need to hear clearly to understand. Adjustable rates. Extension, not qualified yet. I lay in my room staring at the ceiling and let those words pass. I didn't need more information. I only needed confirmation of what I had already suspected. I realized that I hadn't been brought into this house purely out of family ties. Not entirely. I was part of an equation, maybe not at the beginning, but gradually I had become a useful variable, a person with a fixed income, a person with a long credit history, a person in a weak position, easy to persuade, easy to get a signature from. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me alert. I didn't feel betrayed. I felt like I was standing in front of a familiar model, a model I had warned others about, but never imagined would be applied to me. I began to remember more carefully, not writing things down, not storing anything, just remembering. I remembered which days letters arrived. I remembered who called. I remembered what time Michael came home. I remembered the words Emily used when she talked about money. I didn't need proof. I needed context. And that context was becoming clear by the day. One afternoon, I heard Emily say to someone on the phone, "We just need a little more time." I had heard that sentence hundreds of times in my professional life. It wasn't a promise. It was a request for delay. I stood in the hallway, unseen, and realized that my presence in this house was no longer an invisible burden. It had become a contingency plan. I didn't act on that realization. Not yet. I continued living within my role. I asked for money when I needed it. I signed papers when asked. I kept silent, but my silence now was no longer resignation. It was waiting. Because when you've seen a system collapse from the inside, you don't need to investigate to know it's cracking. You only need enough patience to recognize the moment when someone will begin asking you a very specific question, a question they've been preparing for a long time, but haven't dared to ask yet. And I knew that when that question came, it wouldn't be phrased as a major request. It would be wrapped in the language of reason, of family, of temporary necessity. But for me, it would be the moment everything was finally called by its proper name. The first request came on a very ordinary evening. There was no tension in the air, no serious tone. Emily had finished clearing the dishes, Michael was leaning against the kitchen counter, and I was folding paper towels like I did every night. "Dad, can you sign this for us?" Michael said, so casually that if I hadn't been paying attention, I might have thought it was just another routine form in the long line of paperwork I had already grown used to. It was an update to the residency agreement, longer than the previous one, tighter, with a clearer term, no longer the vague idea of staying temporarily, but conditional long-term residence. I read it. There was nothing illegal, no language of coercion, just a way of framing my presence in this house, tight enough to leave no gaps, soft enough to be called reasonable. "Just in case the bank asks," Emily said. "They're reviewing our home file. You know, those little legal things." I nodded. I signed, not because I didn't notice the shift, but because I wanted to see what would come next. Experience had taught me that big requests rarely arrive first. They're always paved with small ones, harmless enough that you don't react. A few days later, Michael handed me another document. "This one just confirms your pension income," he said. "It's only a confirmation. It doesn't affect your benefits at all." I read it. It really was just a confirmation. Amount, frequency, source. No mention of liability, no mention of guarantee. I signed. And as I put the pen down, I realized the two requests shared one thing in common. They both turned me from someone staying temporarily into an entity that could be placed inside a financial file. I didn't say anything. I waited. The big request didn't come immediately. It needed context. It needed timing. And it needed to be wrapped in the right language. Another evening, later than usual, Michael called me into the living room. Emily had already laid out the documents on the table. Not stacked, not messy, everything arranged in order, like a presentation that had been rehearsed. "We're doing a refinance," Michael said, "just to ease the pressure for a while." Emily continued smoothly. "The old interest rate isn't suitable anymore. The bank is asking for an additional co-signer to strengthen the file. Not a co-borrower, just a co-signer." I looked at the two of them. I didn't ask questions. I didn't nod. I let them finish, because I knew that when people talk too much, the truth eventually reveals itself. "Dad doesn't need to worry," Michael added, faster now. "You've already gone bankrupt. What's the risk?" That sentence wasn't spoken with malice. It was said like a calculation, like an obvious fact. And precisely because of that, it was cold enough that I had to pause for a few seconds to be sure I'd heard it correctly. "What do you mean?" I asked. My voice wasn't raised, not lowered, just the normal voice of someone who wants to hear what was just said again. Michael avoided my eyes. Emily looked straight at me, perfectly calm. "What we mean," she said, "is that you don't have assets in your name anymore. No house, no car. The risk is almost zero. On paper, you're the safest option." Safe. That was the word they used. I looked at the stack of papers in front of me. For the first time, I read every line the way I had for 30 years at work. Not to find a flaw, but to understand the structure, and the structure was very clear. If everything went smoothly, my name would never be mentioned. If something went wrong, my signature would be the first place the bank looked. I wasn't angry. I didn't feel deceived. I simply saw all the pieces click into place. The bank letters, the printed emails, the collection calls, temporary, the joint account, income verification, long-term residency. None of it was random. It was a pathway. "Dad just needs to sign," Michael said again. "Just to get through this phase, until things stabilize." I heard that phrase again. Who knew how many times by now? And this time, I heard it for what it really was. A request for an extension on a system that was already out of balance. I placed my hand on the papers, neither signing nor pushing them away. "Do you realize," I said slowly, "that this isn't helping family but shifting risk onto the weakest person in the room?" Michael opened his mouth, then closed it. Emily stayed silent. She knew an argument wouldn't help now. "You don't have anything left to lose," Michael said almost automatically. "You said that yourself." "I did," I said, "but not like this." I stood up. I didn't take the papers. I didn't bring anything with me. I walked back to my room and closed the door without a lock. I sat on the bed and let the feeling settle. Not pain, not shock, but a very cold clarity. I hadn't been brought into this house only because I needed them, but because at some point they would need my signature. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't think about revenge. I didn't plan to expose anyone. I thought about one thing only: boundaries. I had lost money. I had lost my house. I had lost the right to decide within my living space. But I still had one thing: the ability to say no. The next morning, my answer was very short: I won't sign. No explanation, no justification, no moralizing, just the simplest truth. Emily looked at me, her expression changing for the first time since I'd entered this house. Michael was angry, not because I refused, but because I had broken a carefully prepared script. "You're making everything harder," he said. "Temporarily," I replied, "until things stabilize." The words fell into the space between us. No one smiled. No one spoke again. And in that moment, I knew I had reached a point of no return. I was no longer a convenient guest. I had refused to become a legal cushion. And when you refuse that role, the system reacts, not with words, not with emotion, but with action. I didn't yet know exactly what they would do next, but I knew one thing for certain. From this moment on, my staying in this house would no longer be considered temporary. It would be a problem that needed to be resolved. I didn't make a decision that night, not because I was hesitant, but because I knew that the most important decisions don't need to be announced immediately. They need to be placed in daylight, where there's no room left for misunderstanding or excess emotion. The next morning, I woke up early as usual. I folded the blanket, straightened the room, and went to the kitchen to make coffee. No one said anything. Michael and Emily were both there, but the atmosphere in the house was completely different from previous days. The gentle order was gone. There was a very real weight in its place. When I set my coffee cup down on the table, I spoke calmly. No meeting, no pulling out chairs, just a sentence placed in the middle of the kitchen where it seemed all the decisions of this house were made. "I won't sign," I said. "Not now. Not later." I didn't explain. I didn't repeat what had already happened. I didn't talk about risk or legality or ethics. I had said enough in my own head. I also knew that any explanation at this point would be taken as resistance, not a boundary. Michael reacted immediately. He straightened up, his voice higher than usual. "You don't understand," he said. "We just need a little help, just temporarily." I looked at my son. In his eyes, I didn't see malice, but panic. The panic of someone facing the possibility of losing what they had built. I understood that feeling. I had stood in that place before. But understanding doesn't mean sacrificing what little remains of yourself. "I understand," I said, "and I still won't sign." Emily didn't speak right away. She leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching. Her gaze was no longer polite. It was cold, not angry, not accusing, just the look of someone reassessing an option that had just failed. "You're making things more complicated than they need to be," she said evenly. "If this is only temporary, why won't you help your family get through this?" I didn't argue with the way she used the word family. I answered with just one sentence. "Because what you're asking for isn't help," I said. "It's transferring risk." Michael slammed his hand on the table. Not hard, but hard enough to make the coffee cup tremble. "You have nothing left to lose," he said. "You're already bankrupt. What are you even afraid of?" That question didn't need an answer. It was a statement disguised as a question, and in that moment I realized everything had reached its final boundary, not between money and money, but between dignity and convenience. "I've lost many things," I said slowly, "but I haven't lost the right to refuse." No one spoke for a few seconds after that. I could hear the kitchen clock ticking, steady, as if it didn't care that a relationship was changing shape. Emily was the one who broke the silence. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't show emotion. She said just one sentence, very clear, very concise. "If you don't help, you shouldn't be here." That sentence wasn't spoken in anger. It was delivered like a logical conclusion, like the final line in a spreadsheet. I looked at her. Then I looked at Michael. My son didn't object. He didn't defend me. He just stood there, silent, as if that sentence had already existed in his mind, waiting to be spoken. I nodded, not to agree, but to acknowledge. "I understand," I said. And this time, I truly did. I was no longer here because of family. I was here because of convenience. And that convenience had just expired. I went back to my room and closed the door. I sat on the bed and looked around the small space. No lock, no pictures, no personal marks. I realized I had been living in this room like someone waiting to be asked to leave for a long time already. Emily's words were simply the final confirmation. I didn't pack my things right away. I sat there for a while and let the feeling pass. Not anger, not pain, but a strange sense of relief. Because once a boundary has been drawn, you no longer have to pretend you're living in a gray zone. That evening, Michael knocked on my door. He didn't say Dad, he didn't say Daniel, he just knocked. "You should reconsider," he said through the door. "We don't want things to go this far." I stood on my side of the door, my hand on the doorknob. "I've already considered it," I said, "and I won't sign." There was no long conversation, no compromise. I heard his footsteps walk away. In that moment, I knew this decision would have a cost. I wouldn't be staying in this house much longer, but I also knew that if I signed, the cost would be far greater. Not in money, but in the fact that I would no longer recognize myself in the mirror. I lay down on the bed, staring at the ceiling, and for the first time in weeks, I slept. Not deeply, not peacefully, but enough to know that some nights you have to choose between a temporary roof and a solid boundary, and I chose the boundary. I didn't receive an eviction notice, no email, no official document, just an unusual morning where everything was still on schedule, but there was no longer any place for me to stay. Emily said nothing when I walked into the kitchen. Michael was sitting at the table, his phone face down, his arms crossed. I made coffee as I did every day, careful not to make any noise. No one stopped me. No one mentioned the night before. But in that house, silence had changed its meaning. It was no longer order. It was the void left after a decision. "You should make arrangements today," Michael said when I set my cup down. His voice was even, neither raised nor lowered. "We've talked." "Okay," I replied. I didn't ask anything else. Not because I didn't need time, but because I knew that time, at this point, was not something that could be negotiated. Emily stood up and walked toward the hallway. "Just take what's yours," she said. "Documents, personal belongings. We won't make it difficult." I nodded. No arguing. No asking for one more night. No questions about the agreements that had been signed. I knew that in situations like this, arguing only prolongs discomfort, and I no longer had any reason to hold on. I went back to my room. The door still had no lock. I closed it, sat down on the bed, and looked around. The room was so bare that packing didn't take much time. I opened my suitcase, folded my clothes, each piece the way I had done my whole life. No rushing, no shaking hands. I didn't want to leave in chaos. If this was the last time I walked out of this house, I wanted to do it standing straight. The first thing I did wasn't to close the suitcase. I took out my phone and called the bank. I changed the direct deposit back. The voice on the other end asked a few verification questions. I answered clearly. When the call ended, I stared at the screen for a few seconds. My next pension payment would return to my account. Not much, not enough to fix everything, but enough that I wouldn't have to ask anyone for permission anymore. Next came the paperwork. I took the small file box from the closet, birth certificate, insurance papers, medical records, the things no one notices until they're needed. I checked each item and put them back neatly. I didn't take anything that wasn't mine. I didn't want anyone to have a reason to say I had taken extra. When I pulled my suitcase into the hallway, Michael was standing there. He looked at me as if he wanted to say something, then stopped. No apology, no attempt to make me stay. I didn't expect any. I just nodded, like two adults who had just finished a deal that didn't go through. Emily handed me the coat I had hung on the hook by the door. "I wish you well," she said. No sarcasm, no pretense, just the sentence needed to close a situation. "Thank you," I said. I stepped outside. The door closed behind me with a very soft sound. No slamming, no dramatic noise, just a door being properly shut. I stood on the porch for a moment, took a deep breath, and realized that I was no longer in a safe zone, but I was no longer confined either. I pulled my suitcase down the steps. The street in front of the house was still quiet. Neighbors went to work as usual. No one looked at me, and that made sense. Evictions without paperwork usually happen like this. No witnesses, no records, no one noting them except the person leaving. I drove the rental car to a parking lot near downtown. I sat in the car for a while, my hands on the steering wheel, and thought about where I would go next. No long-term plan, just short steps, enough to get through today. I called an old friend. We weren't close, but close enough for me to ask a simple question. Do you know anywhere that rents rooms short term? When the call ended, I looked at the clock. It was only midday. I still had an entire day to figure things out, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like I was running away. I was leaving. I didn't know then that this decision would make my life harder for a while. I only knew that if I stayed, it would make me smaller every day. I had lost my house. I had lost my place in the family, but I hadn't lost the ability to walk out of a room where I was no longer respected. As I started the car, I looked back at the street one last time, not out of regret, but to remember there are places you once think of as shelters, until you realize that safety isn't about having a roof over your head, but about not signing away the parts of yourself that make you who you are. And with a single suitcase, I left that safe zone, without eviction papers, without an argument, carrying only one boundary that I had managed to keep at the cost of walking away. I didn't find a place to stay that same day. The old friend pointed me to a small motel near the highway, rented by the week. Not nice, not very quiet, but clean. And most importantly, no one asked me to sign anything beyond my ID and the first week's rent. I paid, took the key, and stepped into a room just big enough for a single bed, a folding table, and my suitcase. I set the suitcase down, sat on the bed, and let the silence settle in. Not the tense silence of a house where you're always careful, just ordinary silence, the kind that lets you breathe deeply without asking permission. The first few days passed slowly. I walked a lot. I bought cheap food and cooked for myself. I spent time reorganizing my paperwork, updating my address, calling the bank to reconfirm everything. When the next pension payment was deposited back into my account, I opened the banking app and looked at the number on the screen. Not large, but it was mine. I didn't feel relieved because of the money. I felt relieved because I didn't have to explain myself. I found a part-time job, not because I needed to prove anything, but because I needed a rhythm. A nearby warehouse needed someone for evening inventory checks. The work was simple, repetitive, and no one asked me about my past. I went to work, went back to my room, slept. No one managed my time except me. And in those seemingly small things, I began to regain the feeling of standing firmly on my own feet. I didn't contact Michael, not because I was angry, but because I didn't want to turn my decision into another negotiation. I knew that if I called, the conversation would circle back to the familiar words, temporary, stabilize, just a little help. And I no longer had the strength to live in those gray areas. A few weeks later, I heard through an acquaintance that Michael and Emily hadn't been able to refinance. The bank rejected the proposal they submitted. The adjustable rate reached its term. They were forced to put the house up for sale, or at least move to something smaller. No one called me to place blame. No one asked me to come back and sign. I don't know whether they thought of me as a missed option or not, but I know one thing. The system they were trying to maintain couldn't stand on its own, and my refusal wasn't the cause. It only revealed the truth sooner. Some evenings, after my shift, I sat on the bed, looking at the bare wall, thinking about everything that had happened. I thought about Helen. I wondered what she would have said if she were still alive. Maybe she wouldn't have said much. She would have just placed her hand on mine the way she always did when I made a difficult decision. And in that silence, I would have known I had done the right thing. I'm not telling this story to make myself a victim. I'm not telling it to make my son a villain. Michael isn't a bad person. He was just a man backed into a corner, trying to hold on to something beyond his means. Emily isn't cruel. She's simply someone who believes in structure, in numbers, and in the idea that everything must be controlled. The problem wasn't them. The problem was the moment they looked at me and saw a solution instead of seeing a human being. I lost many things that year. I lost my house. I lost my car. I lost my place in my family. But there was one thing I didn't lose, and almost did, and that was my boundary. When you've lost nearly everything, boundaries are the last thing protecting you from becoming a convenient signature. Some people ask if I regret it. The answer is no, not because what came afterward was easy. It wasn't. But because if I had signed, I wouldn't have just lost money in the future. I would have lost the ability to look myself in the mirror every morning. And at 63 years old, that's a price I'm no longer willing to pay. My life now is smaller, fewer belongings, fewer choices, but every choice is mine. I don't need permission to turn on a light. I don't need to explain myself to buy a book. I don't need to wait for someone to transfer money so I can buy medication. I don't have much, but I have enough. Enough to live the rest of my life true to myself. I don't know where my relationship with Michael will go. Maybe one day we'll talk again. Maybe we won't. I don't close the door on that possibility. But if that day comes, it will come from a different place. Not from dependence, but from mutual respect. I learned something late but necessary. Being a father doesn't mean sacrificing everything, especially when that sacrifice only helps others delay facing the truth. Sometimes the best thing you can do for your family isn't signing another piece of paper. It's standing up and walking away. I can't undo the mistakes that led me to bankruptcy. I can't change how people looked at me when I had nothing left, but I did keep something more important than a house or money. I kept myself.